Welcome to Caped Conversations, Ohio University's Center for Applied and Professional Ethics podcast series. I'm Christoph Hanisch, an associate philosophy professor at OU and the director of CAPE. My co-host is James Petrick, who is a philosophy professor and the center's assistant director. Our center's mission is to advance practical, ethical, and moral understanding, judgment, and decision-making. On Caped Conversations, we talk to experts in ethics, moral psychology, and moral philosophy. We will discuss how and why current contemporary debates matter, not just in academic circles but in everyday life, especially as society and technology keep changing. We thank Ohio University, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Department of Philosophy, and the Scripps School of Journalism for their support. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Caped Conversation, the podcast series of the Center for Applied and Professional Ethics at Ohio University. My name is Christoph Hanisch. I'm the director of the center, and in the studio with me today is Professor James Petrick, assistant director of the center, and we also have our two podcast producers and assistants to the center. Welcome Gretchen Saar and Jack Almoro. And it is a great pleasure to welcome our guest today. Our podcast guest today is Professor Nancy Sherman.
Thank you.
Professor Sherman, great to have you. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Professor Sherman is a distinguished university professor and professor of philosophy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She has an affiliate appointment with Georgetown Law's Center on National Security and the Law, and Professor Sherman holds a Ph.D. from Harvard University in ancient philosophy. Before joining the Georgetown University faculty, Professor Sherman taught at Yale University, and she is also a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland. Moreover, from 1997 through 1999, she served as the inaugural Distinguished Chair in Ethics at the U.S. Naval Academy. Sherman is the author of over 70 articles in the area of ethics, military ethics, the history of moral philosophy, ancient ethics, the emotions, moral psychology, and psychoanalysis. In addition to an impressive education and biography in academic philosophy, Professor Sherman has training in psychotherapy from the Washington Center for Psychoanalysis. Focusing just on a couple of monographs, her most recent book is Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2021. This book was featured in the list of New York Times notable authors. Her forthcoming title, which is also going to be part of our subject matter that we're discussing today.
Right.
That book is going to be called Feed the Soul, Lessons from Aristotle on Living Well. And other books particularly relevant for the field of military ethics include After War, Healing the Moral Wounds of Our Soldiers, The Untold War, Inside the Hearts, Minds, and Souls of Our Soldiers, which was a New York Times editor's pick, and Stoic Warriors, the Ancient Philosophy Behind the Military Mind. So again, thank you for joining the podcast series, and we are looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, and thank you for that very generous introduction.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here. We got through the exhilarating part for you where you have to sit quietly and listen to all your accomplishments being read out loud.
Yes, that's the embarrassing part.
But you did a good Stoic job of not betraying any emotion. So, well, we're going to start with a lighter question. And we actually began this tradition with our last visiting speaker and guest on the podcast. And I participate in a fantasy football league. And it made me start to think, if there were a fantasy philosophy league or a fantasy philosophers league, and you had the first pick, whom would you select?
No question about it, Aristotle.
Aristotle, okay. So the subject of your forthcoming book.
Right.
Aristotle. And you mentioned, I think, in your lecture yesterday that Aristotle was known as the philosopher in the medieval period in Western medieval Christian philosophy, that he was so important you didn't have to name him. He was just the philosopher. And our last guest actually reminded me, he also selected Aristotle, Mark Levar, and he reminded me that Shaquille O'Neal had given a press conference during the height of his career saying he wanted henceforth to be known as the Big Aristotle.
I
that
heard
reason.
that.
Yeah.
My husband conveyed that information to me, and I thought, ooh, maybe I should get a promotional from him.
Yeah. I bet you could get a blurb. That is worth trying. So, Shaq, if you happen to be listening to our podcast, please reach out to Professor Sherman. But I also want to get some input from Christoph. I know who Christoph picked last time, but are you sticking with your first round pick if you had the first choice in a philosophy fantasy
I
genre?
think it would still be Kant overall. Yeah,
Fair enough.
Good choice.
Now I'll go over to our executive producer, Jack Almoro, who you can see is sporting a very handsome Hall & Oat mugs today.
Yes.
Jack, who would be your first selection?
Not mentioned before, but I would pick Plato because I think I see him just over-exaggerated, but he's sort of the creator of both Socrates and Aristotle. What we know of Socrates is from Plato, and then obviously being the teacher of Aristotle, it just makes sense that, he's sort of the creator of both, even though Aristotle diverged a bit. And the dialogues, I think, is just a great way to convey philosophy, especially, at his time. So
Early, very good choice. A nice explanation of the rationale there, just for future reference. So try not to be more articulate than the hosts of the show. But yeah, Plato is hard to argue with. You might have also referred to Alfred North Whitehead, who famously said that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato.
Right.
All right, now to our content producer, Gretchen Saar, whom I have to embarrass by noting she also is a member of 2 bands. So if you're ever in the Athens, Ohio area, you should hope to try and check out either Feline Frenzy or Blush. But
Thank you, Dr.
And Blush is an all-women's band, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
And in the podcast studio, I'm not Dr. Petrick, I'm James, so we can all be on a first-name basis here. But having said that, you have the first pick in the Philosopher's Fantasy Draft. Who are you taking?
Originally, I was going to say Kant, but especially after the lecture yesterday by Professor Sherman, I think I would also go with Aristotle. I think that going back to, the roots and the foundations of the philosopher would just be a really strong pick and would probably catch up a lot of philosophers. I would say Aristotle.
All right, very good. Well, I'm going to write my own rules because I can, and that is I'll imagine I have the second pick because like Christoph, I would have gone for Kant as my first pick. But I'm going to change things up quite a bit. You had mentioned last night, Nancy, that in sort of Asian philosophical circles that Aristotle is often referred to as the first teacher. Right. And that's something I learned from a few trips I've done to Kazakh National University. But they are also in Kazakhstan very high on Al-Farabi, whom they refer to as the second teacher following Aristotle. So I'm going to go with Al-Farabi as my pick.
What a wonderful connection.
Yeah. And there's dispute over where Al-Farabi was born. The Kazakhs want to make the case that he was born in Western Kazakhstan, but it's highly disputed and it's not entirely clear. But they claim Al-Farabi as their native son.
I think we should get Sasha Cohn to weigh in on how he's going to, where he's going to place him.
Yeah, that would be another good guess. So Sasha Baron Cohen, if you're listening to the podcast, reach out to us. A little bit of background about Stoic Wisdom and the use we were making of that. In addition to being our producers for this podcast, Jack and Gretchen are running a reading group at the local library for community members. We call it the Agora Group or the Agora Reading Group. And the work that they are focusing on in this reading group was Stoic Wisdom, Ancient Lessons for Modern Resilience. And they've had 2 sessions of the group so far. The third and final session is tonight, and Professor Sherman has graciously agreed to join the group for the final session. But I think for that reason, since you have really worked intimately with the book and connected it with people in the community, not in academic philosophy, I wanted to throw it open to the two of you to ask some of the first questions about Stoic wisdom.
All right. Yeah, sure. I'll get us started. So a lot of the book, I feel, was sort of not a denouncing, but just going away from the modern interpretation of Stoicism, with the current, it goes through self-help videos, or it's the tech bros, Silicon Valley type of people. So I just wanted to ask you, is there any merit to how Stoicism has been popularized today through the self-help framing, or is that just a flawed interpretation of what Stoicism is, a sort of, I think as you would put it, a neo-Stoicism?
Great question. Well, I wrote the book in part because modern Stoicism, which it's often called, at the time, not so much now, but then was really about grit and resilience. And as I mentioned last night in my talk, at the Naval Academy, where they viewed themselves as Stoics, probably with a little s, they hadn't yet studied Stoicism until they got to me, they said, suck it up and truck on. So it was how you manage in deprivation, because one of their own, James Bond Stockdale, had memorized Epictetus's little handbook before he was shot down in Vietnam, and he used it as his salvation in what was called the Hanoi Hilton, which was the POW camp in North Vietnam. And he was there for 7.5 years. So, along with John McCain, for example, who's probably better known. But one of the self-helps that people seem to cotton onto, and now in more psychotherapeutic fields, is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And even some of the founders, Ellis and Beck, refer to a line or two of essentially the dichotomy of control of Epictetus. There are some things within your control and some things outside. So they pick that up as a way to demarcate what you can and can't change as an agent. But they also are cognitive therapists. They believe that emotions have thought content, and they don't go into the detail a philosopher would about what that means in terms of, is it a judgment, is it a looser construal, a perception. They don't really worry about some of these things that philosophers worry about when they're thinking about truth claims. But that said, there are thoughts, and you can alter those thoughts, change those thoughts, sometimes relive the thoughts in reconstruals. Sometimes they're painful, obviously in flashbacks. But you can reframe. So the idea of reframing a situation where the cognitive content, by cognitive content I mean the thoughts you're having. Sometimes they're very ruminating. You ruminate, and that takes you down a rabbit hole. So some have picked this up. I've sometimes found it a little, not flat-footed, but, the Stoics were practical philosophers, and that's part of the appeal. They were household philosophers of a sort. They're in the households where elite Romans were educated. And so there's a lot of how-to, the kind of how-to you wouldn't find, frankly, in Plato or Aristotle. These are much more street philosophers. And that's clearly part of the appeal. You can pick up little fragments hither and thither, or very witty epigrammatic sayings in Epictetus's case. And so that's part of the way in which it's graspable. You don't have to sit down and read a treatise. Or Marcus Aurelius, meditations while he's in battle. Some people actually, I think James Mattis, who was Secretary of Defense for a while, and certainly high-ranking Marine, used to carry, I think it was Marcus Aurelius. Others have carried Epictetus in their kits as they go out to war. or go downrange. So it's been distorted a bit, simplified. You have to be careful with some aspects, like pre-rehearse the bads. In classes, my students often say, "You mean I'm supposed to pre-traumatize so I don't get post-trauma?" That is a worry, how to modulate it. And also how to make sure you're not suppressing emotions, because distress is one of the emotions they don't really approve of, because it is perturbing. How you don't suppress but reimagine, reframe, make more congenial in some way. So it's got some roots there, and but it has been misused, I think, in the manosphere to talk about toughing it out and excluding women. Some very misogynistic claims. Tech bros, if they want to take cold baths, like it. Which I heard Dorsey, who is the founder of Twitter initially, he said something to the effect that he follows Epictetus in taking a cold bath in the morning and walking to work without a coat. And one of his interviewers, who is Canadian, and I think he mentioned this when he was in Toronto, said, "Excuse me, sir, but winters in Palo Alto are not as cold as they are in Toronto."
So if you were to introduce someone to Stoicism, kind of how you have said, what advice would you give to guide them to study and practice Stoicism without reducing it to that kind of modern self-help? Do you have any advice that you tell people when you introduce them to Stoicism?
Right. One is to think a little bit more about the emotions that, on their view, the Stoic view, doesn't always come across in some of the writings of Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus, but it's in the ancient sources. Emotions have 3 layers, and I think it's really prescient, really tells us a lot about what we think now. So one of the lower levels of emotions, which people can think about easily, they call them proto-emotions or preludes to affect, is the way Seneca puts it, on anger. And they're what we would call lower brain responses that are very adaptive. You get chills if you stick your hand in water. Your hair might rise. If there's something scary, you blush. If you're embarrassed or ashamed, they're autonomic, part of your sympathetic system, and you can't easily change them. They say if you don't assent, so say yes, to the thought that you're experiencing, or just the impulse, because there's not a lot of thinking that's going on. It's very fast. Suspend the yes. Don't say yes. And then it won't bud or blossom, you might say, into a full-blown emotion. The full-blown emotions are the ones that you worry about because they sort of stick with you. So ordinary fear, ordinary anxiety, though that term doesn't come up till much later, ordinary anger, and those are just ordinary emotions, both with regard to things that are present and with regard to fear is something in the future, a future threat. Something like distress is a bad that's with us right now, but also pleasure and joy. So those are the ordinary emotions, and we all experience them. So that's the second level. And it's worth knowing about that as you think about emotions. The third is something I actually think Kant might pick up on, and I don't really know. He talks about pathological inclinations, which might be that second layer I just talked about, which can go off, meaning you can't stop being angry, you can't curb it easily, can't stop it on a dime in the way, if I lift my arm, I can then put it down if I'm not disabled. But there are these rational emotions. There's a shade of this in Aristotle, of course, in his notion of irrational desire. But there are rational emotions, and the rational emotions understand that the real goods and bads out there are not the bear that's scary, or not the loss of your spouse that's grievous, or not having your next beer or something of that sort, but rather they have to do with your virtue. And so the real bads out there is doing something vicious. The real bads out there, the real goods out there is are virtuous deeds, cultivating virtue. And so, and they eliminate distress because they can't come up with a good version of that. It's just too disturbing. So that's an interesting thought. And back to Kant, I think those might be the practical emotions that he starts talking about in the doctrine of virtue. They're not really pathological inclinations. I don't know if respect would be one of those, Kantian respect, Achtung, but nonetheless, he does and later on talk about practical virtue. So the idea of educating your emotions, they actually walk you through 3 steps, and they say the bottom one, where you have these quick reactions, are actually quite useful. Like Seneca says, how could you not feel distress when you read of, I don't know, Antony doing something to another Roman, plunging a knife in or something like that? How could you not feel, how could the general not have his knees knock when he hears the clarion call to go to battle? How could an orator's hands not get a little numb as she walks on stage and has to give a speech before the Roman assembly? That kind of thing. And so those are very interesting emotions. Some neuroscientists think those might be low-level emotions in the sense of maybe the lower brain. They don't go through the full circuitry that's up north and in our cerebellum up here, but rather a kind of primitive but real defense system. Some don't even want to call it fear. But, fear requires more thought processes, as Joseph Ledoux, a neurobiologist who talks about this stuff. So those are some things. The layering of emotions and knowing that some of them are really very, very survival response. And others you can get stuck on. And then you can try to cultivate them to make them more manageable.
Yeah. Right. And just touching on one more thing. You touched on the pre-rehearsal of bads. In that same chapter in your book, you also talk about mental reservations and hedges. You bring up an example from Seneca, and I know Dr. Petrick brought up this in one of our planning sessions for the Agora group. So the mental technique here from Seneca is saying, I will set sail unless something interferes, or my business will become successful unless something interferes. And so I think a worry that was raised was, is that too much of a defeatist mindset? It's sort of a mental cushion, but what's the line there from preventing that cushion from becoming harmful to our goals?
Good question. I guess it's where you set the unless. Is a drizzle the rain? A downpour seems to be. How long will you stick with the business before you're in chapter 11 and you have to go south? So some of that is judgment call, I guess. There is generally a worry that you think or preoccupy yourself so much with these bads that you live with them rather than not think about them a lot. So it could be that. I have read about studies, these were used by some of the defense forces abroad, where they do have subliminal triggers in booths, not unlike this, a lab of some sort, psychological lab, where they expose some of the soldiers to some of the triggers that they might experience downrange, and that kind of prepares them, their brain, not so much their consciousness, their brain for the kinds of experiences they may have later on. So that is a kind of pre-exposure. It's exposure therapy of a sort, but at the first end, at the front end rather than at the back end, as exposure theory is often used.
Yeah. Interesting question, Jack. Interesting answer too. That line of questioning makes me think a bit of, I had some of the worry that Jack mentioned about, well, is it going to cultivate a defeatist mindset or a mindset where you might give up too quickly as opposed to pushing through obstacles? But at the time, I hadn't thought of what might be seen as the positive side of it acting as a corrective against falling prey to what economists call the fallacy of sunk costs, right? Where no, there's a time at which the rational thing to do is to cut your losses and move on. So I could see, yeah, it's another case where, as Aristotle might put it, finding the mean is important in employing that technique.
Yeah, that's a good, the economic examples are good.
But what you were talking about there, too, in sort of military settings reminded me a bit of, and Jack's question reminded me of the TED Talk you mentioned, having watched by Tim Ferriss, in which he has a kind of Stoic recommendation that you list your fears of, and you rank those fears as to things that can go wrong. Then you make a list of steps you might take to avoid the bad outcome coming into play. And then you also formulate a plan for remediating the bad outcome should it happen. And again, I was wondering, do you think, for Ferriss or for the Stoics or for yourself, is that a recipe that should be followed in our day-to-day lives? Because thinking about my life in those terms, if that's something I should rehearse every day, it seems that it would make for a pretty dreary existence. Or is it really a recipe for when you're embarking on something significant or something new? What's your take on what Ferriss had in mind or what the Stoics might think about those kinds of cases?
Right. Well, Ferriss was, I think, dealing with some real business crises. And as a personality, I mean, he's very upfront about some of his struggles. Mm-hmm. He went to Princeton. He had a lot of mental health issues. So I think he's been looking for some psychological salve to help. I often think that kind of preparation is a little bit too premeditative and deliberative, as you suggested. Seneca has a comparable, which is at night when it's all quiet, go through the day, and my wife is asleep, he says, go through the day and write down the things that went wrong. They're often very petty offenses. I got angry at the doorman who didn't let me into the residence. I got angry at being seated at the dais in the wrong place. So they're very trivial affronts. And he writes them down as a form of self-remediation. Tomorrow I'll be better. But there's a funny line, actually. I think it was Steve Martin with Carl Reiner. Steve Martin calls Carl Reiner late at night. I guess they were friends. And he says, are you sleeping? He said, sleeping? I'm going through all the horrible things I did today. How could I sleep? Something to that effect. And that's sort of what I think. Yeah. It's ruminating. Yeah. And so the word ruminating has come to have a psychological tone, not one that's particularly healthy. So I sometimes worry, where is that line between rumination and what Aristotle would call athismos, cultivating character? He doesn't have you go through exercises. He has you live your life and watch your life and modulate a little this way and that way, almost like a new driver. Am I in lane? Am I not in lane? Let me double check. And next time round, it will be a little bit more automatic. I think that's more the way I would go. I'm not a big list maker or diary keeper. I was as a younger person, but no longer. So, yeah, I think it can veer into rumination too quickly.
Yeah. Interesting.
One thing that strikes me as a very important distinguishing feature of Stoicism, both ancient and contemporary, seems to be that it is really primarily an ethical theory, a moral theory of individual behavior, individual cultivation of individual character and attitudes. And I'm just wondering, also in light of contemporary political and social developments, if you think a kind of political philosophy could be developed on the basis of Stoicism. And I think one passage that made me think about this particular question is this fascinating account that you reconstruct concerning slavery and what some Stoics who were themselves slaves said about slavery. And you say, well, it seems a bit of a shortcoming of the theory that it only, so to speak, focuses on slavery in terms of what impact it has on internal freedom. So there's no explicit condemnation of the social, political, and economic practice of slavery in Stoicism. And I was just wondering, wouldn't it be quite easy to develop an argument on Stoic grounds? Because there's the cosmopolitan idea, there's the idea of equality, it seems, that is very, very progressive in already ancient Stoicism. But for one reason or the other, apparently the Stoics don't think that these external impediments on liberty and freedom matter that much because they are indifference, as they call it.
Yeah,
right?
you nailed it. Yeah, they are indifference. And so the social, yes, while they're creating an empire, a cosmos, Marcus Aurelius certainly is out there killing Germans, the Germanic tribes. The barbarians crossing the Danube. And that's a long-term project. If you read the emperors, they're always out there on campaign. But Seneca is thinking. He's explicitly talks about this. He himself wasn't enslaved. He was exiled in Corsica on grounds of adultery with, I think, Claudius's niece. Epictetus, as you say, was an enslaved person who got freedom during Nero's time. And they very much, I mean, there are horrible things going on outside there in the building of the Roman Empire. And there's constant conspiracy mongering and constant attacks and death threats and poisonings and all that go with power. And they do think that the inner virtue, which is essentially reason, the work of reason and the operations of reason, are where freedom is. Now, that said, they have servants. Seneca has a whole cast of servants. It would make Downton Abbey look understaffed. I mean, there's someone to do the vineyards and someone to clean the glasses and goblets and buy the food and cook the food. It goes on and on and on. And they need those in order to keep up their estates. But they worry, given that we're all equal and given we all have reason, what do we do about that? And so Seneca, sometimes in a tract in the letters that's taken to be very modern, suggests, well, we treat them as full human beings and remember slave owners and masters that they too have reason and and don't get so angry at them and the like. That said, some, like Finlay, I think, a commentator, an English commentator of standing on the ancient world, thinks that this is just a way of making sure that the runaway slaves, the fugitive enslaved people, won't bring charges against you as being a cruel master. I mean, that is always on their mind. They'll lose, not only will they lose their household servants, but they may be brought to court by an enslaved person. So some of it is just prudential.
Yeah,
it's not instrumental.
Yeah.
It's not moral.
Yeah.
So I've never really seen it as very moral.
Yeah.
But you're right. They're not restructuring
Yeah.
the external world to make for a more just system.
Yeah. It reminds me of something that I recently read in Hannah Arendt when she describes, and that's not just in Hannah Arendt, I know that from personal conversations with people who lived through the Austrian fascist state and the Third Reich, that many who, so to speak, internally disagreed with the regime they retreated, so to speak, into the private sphere and said to themselves something along the Stoic lines of, well, what's going on outside of my private realm, I have no control over, and so I retreat into the private sphere of freedom. And Arendt says, yeah, this is exactly, unfortunately, what happens in a totalitarian system. So the worry might be that a Stoic framework is not having the resources to come up with a counter-argument to these kinds of tendencies to
protect yourself.
Protect yourself, you retreat into your own home, and because that's where you have sovereignty, that's where you have control, and these external circumstances, unfortunately, are whatever they are.
So you become a very split person,
Yeah.
and which is the experience of many. You know, the ordinary man, as some of the writings go, who seems totally ordinary at home during the day, but who goes out and does horrible things, or during the evening, totally ordinary, and during the day does horrible things that they would never consider were they in the private sphere. So yeah, there's that, so how do you react? Well, often it's in retrospect. All of those retrospective emotions start spilling out. The guilt, the shame, or what I write about a lot with soldiering, but it's a far more pervasive phenomenon than just in service members. Moral injury. Something happens to you, or you are the agent of horrible things happening, or you witness horrible things happening and you don't intervene. All of those compromises of yourself, of your moral self, may not be felt immediately, but they could be felt afterwards. But they also, we always worry about time. We were talking earlier about statute of limitations in terms of a political system bringing charges against you for your involvement in evil. But does your soul have a statute of limitations? I guess it depends on each of our souls.
Interesting. Yeah, very interesting discussion. I wasn't thinking of it this way, but kind of connected to that. I'm interested also talking a bit about the Stoic view of death and how to approach death. And I will confess that I am sort of very ambivalent in one sense, that I find the Stoic position very attractive, and that is that, face it with kind of equanimity in a clear-eyed way, recognize it's something all human beings have to deal with, and that has a certain appeal. Socrates, I guess, is one of the exemplars for the Stoics, although for him, at least as it's portrayed in the Phaedo, he is looking forward to an afterlife when the soul is liberated from the body and he can really pursue wisdom. But setting that aside, with respect to the attitudes of death, I find the Stoic position attractive, but I also find very attractive a sentiment that I think couldn't be more unstoic, and that's reflected in Dylan Thomas's poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light," which I think is very anti-Stoic at a number of levels. First, the rage, right? It's an embracing of anger against the dying of the light, but it's not something you should reconcile yourself to, and that's for the sake of inner peace. And that, interestingly, kind of connects with the worry about Stoicism and totalitarianism. Christoph is... in the case of totalitarianism, you find this sort of inner freedom and you retreat into that. In the case of an attitude toward death, maybe Dylan Thomas is right. This is not a reality we should be at peace with. We should be at war against the dying of the light.
That's a great juxtaposition. I hadn't thought of the Dylan Thomas poem. Stoicism could be, as I said earlier, kind of pre-traumatization. You're thinking about death so often, you're pre-rehearsing it, that you're kind of a fatalist. You're acquiescing, which was your worry too, and but preoccupied in a certain way because it's present in your mind. You're dwelling in the future, a phrase Cicero uses. You're anticipating the future. So that is a problem I have to say, just as a slight anecdote, I think I might have been channeling the Stoics when my mother, approaching 97 in a nursing home, hadn't yet mentioned death, right? Here she was being fully cared for. And so I said, Mom, just remind me, did we sign you up for the immortality plan? Because if we did, it's going to be really expensive. Which point she laughed, she smiled gently, and I think we got to talk about it a little bit. She did die about 3 days, a week later, and she wanted it as far from her mind as possible. So introducing it non-obsessively but gently might be the way to be a Stoic about this. I don't think much about death, but recently I've seen some of my very, very close friends suffer very traumatically. The body, the aging body does certain things that you didn't anticipate, and all of a sudden you've got a terminal malignancy with a very, very quick there's no healing, just some comfort at the end, and that seeing the spouse and the family deal with very unexpected death has been eye-opening, and you grieve in advance, I have to say. So it's not so much you keep anticipating, but if it's upon you, I think you are not just grieving afterwards, but in a grieving mode before. Cicero was in this position, and he railed against the Stoics on this account. He was a transmitter, not a sort of a fellow traveler, co-traveler, but not necessarily a follower. And he gives us a lot of our texts because he's on the cusp of the Greek world and the Latin world. And he essentially loses his daughter Tullia, with whom he was really close. She dies in childbirth, and he can't stay in Rome. There's one political controversy after another, and so he gets out of town fast, and he goes to his estate in the Tusculan Hills, about a day's journey, those days, from Rome. And he goes through a whole library of a friend Atticus, and comes up short. He's looking for consolation, therapy, self-help to console his grieving. And he says of Cleantes' method, which Cleantes, one of the three founding fathers of Stoicism, that it's to deny us, to try to deny us of distress and grief, is to remove our unwisdom, the absence of wisdom, and this is no time for such a lesson. So, in the throes of loss and mourning, to start saying it was nothing to me, it didn't matter, he finds callous, morally, almost a kind of moral wanton, amoral. And so that is very powerful. This is in Tusculan Disputations. And so there is a critic of the period suggesting that he needs something more in times of real family grief.
Yeah, that's very. Sorry, Denise. That's very interesting because in our reading group we talked a lot about that chapter with the grief and anger, and we had some people talk about how sometimes anger comes with grief. It's easier to hold on to. It's easier to deal with. You deal with anger often in your life. It feels more conceptual almost. But we had one guy in our group. I think he was like in the Peace Corps. He studied philosophy before, but he said something really I found beautiful. He said he doesn't see the two as like in tandem because he sees anger as being something ugly, usually coming from like hate or just more negative feelings and whatnot. But he sees grief as something being beautiful because in order to have grief, we had to love somebody or love something. So it comes from a place of love versus a place of hate. And that really, I wrote that down. It really stuck with me, and it sounds pretty familiar.
Very interesting. Yeah.
To what you were saying. Very similar.
Yeah, that's a thoughtful response. Really interesting. Grief is the other side of attachment. If you didn't really attach, you couldn't really grieve. If you didn't love, you can't really lose. and grief is regarding loss. Now, Seneca says you sort of build yourself up, to the real big ones and try to premeditate that. You lose a jug that you break, or get angry and, sort of mad that you ended up at the pool at a time that's so busy. And there are pickpockets. But I think, too, grief can be, and Cicero suggests this, he's really advanced. He goes through all sorts of methods for trying to relieve his grief, from the Epicureans to the Stoics, to the skeptics even. And he suggests that, and so time comes up a lot, the passage of time, that's a healer. But he also sort of suggests that there are different kinds of reactions we can have. This is part of the Stoic view of emotions, that you both have a thought about what the target object is that is causing the emotion, but you also have a thought, a second judgment or second thought about how you react, what you do in the face of it. Those are two separate moments, conceptual moments at least. And with regard to grief, I often worry, and this is just in the psychological literature, there is a kind of chronic grief syndrome, and that is you can't get rid of the grief. And that's not healthy. I mean, that can be a pathology. I'm sure it has a diagnosis. I don't know what it is in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistics Manual. But that said, our word mausoleum comes from this kind of issue that Mausolus, I think, I'm not sure if I have that exactly right, dies, and his wife goes every day to the mausoleum. And that preoccupation with not letting go of a dead one, not just grieving, but not letting go of the dead one, having to visit the site every day. Some people visit graves every day for years and years and years and years. That doesn't seem particularly healthy either. So, interesting thought your Peace Corps guy had.
Yeah, it was really beautifully phrased as well.
Very nice. The time is just flying, and we want to
make
sure we have time to talk about your forthcoming book on Aristotle. And so, as Christoph mentioned earlier, the title is Feed the Soul, right? Lessons from Aristotle on Living Well.
Yes.
And it's coming out this year.
Well, I wish it was this year, but we're postponing it so that there's not a lot of friction in the air in November. And it's January. So January 1. And I'm sure you can pre-order it. And it will be Yale University Press.
Yeah, very good, very good. Do you want to give us a sort of synopsis? You can talk about what led you into wanting to write on Aristotle, write this book in particular, and some of the main themes, and then we can follow up with some questions.
Very happy to do that. Thank you for the opportunity. So some of you may picked up, I have a sort of a gentler stoicism that has a social dimension not often mentioned in other writings on Stoicism. And I was channeling Aristotle, who says that we are social and political animals, and our self-sufficiency is relational. It's kind of irony, but we are self-sufficient living together with friends, family, in a city, and so on. So, and he's thinking of a smaller city than the cosmos, face-to-face kind of community, and that's just been with me all my years of philosophical study. I studied Aristotle, and as an undergraduate, I give great homage to my teacher at Bryn Mawr Haverford, R.A. Cosman, who's a great classical philosopher, and he turned me on to the metaphysics, as it was the study of substance. But I quickly moved to the ethics, which I wrote my dissertation on, and actually moral habituation in Aristotle. And, my first book was The Fabric of Character, but then I thought, it is time to return to that. It's, 5-6 books later. My head is still always in Aristotle. So I wanted to think about the ways in which the title came, Feed the Soul. Because Aristotle thinks of the soul not as something immortal, but as just what keeps us alive. It keeps plants alive. It keeps animals alive. Any living creature has a soul. Ours has more reason than some of the other living organisms, but we live with them. And so I wanted to think of him as not just the ethical philosopher, and I don't really talk much about the metaphysics in this book, but also as the first marine biologist. That just fascinated me. Images of Aristotle walking on the beaches in Lesbos, the island of Lesbos, after he left Athens, and collecting mollusks and dissecting them and thinking about where is their soul, not in the sense, again, of a religious soul, but just in the sense of what makes them tick, what keeps them alive, and is the central functioning system for all their operations, which is how he really thinks of the soul. When the soul dies, when the body dies, the soul dies. They go together. And it is your life force, you might say. So I started thinking about that, and it gave me freedom to think a little bit about myself and Aristotle, because I have walked with Aristotle for the better part of my life, I guess you would say at this point. And I thought, well, I really have always focused on friendship in much of my writing and common pursuits and shared living. So there's material on that. But as I mentioned yesterday in the talk, there's a lighter side to it, which is joking, play, which are activities we do together. And his views are a critique of modern friendship if it's on a screen. I think if he were to be in a restaurant with us and saw people dining, he's very big on doing things together with intimate and close friends. And if they do that, and but they're not talking to each other, but on screens, these little things, he wouldn't know what to call them, mirrors in their hands. That's not friendship. And so it became a sort of a critique. I think the former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has been talking a lot about this, and his notion of a new epidemic of loneliness is how he puts it, and a worry. And we worry about this a lot in our teaching worlds and our communities. So that was one thing that came up a lot. Another thing that came up a lot was, as I mentioned, being part of nature, being part of your natural habitat, whether you're in the marine wetlands or walking in the woods. And I also thought, well, the Greeks, Plato, and Aristotle all situated their learning centers near gyms, because the gymnasium or the academy, the lyceum or the academy, were on the sites where young, in those days, men congregated to work out, we would call it, but to exercise naked, because that's the word gymnos is naked, and so that was their mode of exercise, with oil on their body, especially if they were wrestling. And I think they then put some sand on it as well. And I wanted to talk about sports and athletics and all the different ways. And I realized Aristotle has a ton of things to say about wrestling and the kind of body you need and the kind of body you need for boxing, and diet, how you hit the mean. And one later commentator thought of coaching, training, being a physical trainer as a kind of Sophia, wisdom. So all of that I hadn't thought was really, and you see in Greek vases all these athletic images of runners and javelin throwers and discus throwers standing next to their trainers. And I thought, that's his world. He was also apparently a sports nerd, a stats nerd. He collected a lot of statistics or lists of the Olympic victors over the years. So that seemed very contemporary, And I wanted to think about it.
Football.
Oh, yes, he might enjoy fantasy football.
He doesn't mention who his first pick would be.
Well, Milo of Croton comes up, but that's the superhero. I don't know who he has this fraught relationship with Plato. I loved my Plato, or my first teacher in philosophy, but I love the truth more.
Yeah.
Hence, I have to go off and do my own thing.
Yeah.
A lesson for all you students.
Yeah.
with respect to the cultivation of, or feeding the soul in these different areas, so there is sort of speculative inquiry, like you were talking about his interest in marine biology. There's the cultivation of physical excellence. There is, in your talk last night, you mentioned also, even in terms of humor and being witty, there are ways that are appropriate and inappropriate. The truly witty person, the person who achieves a kind of mean, I suppose, with respect to humor, doesn't fall prey to just nasty barbs, but at the same time also doesn't lapse into just buffoonery, things like that. So we cultivate all these sides of the human being, the physical, the sort of speculative intellectual, the artistic. To what extent is living well, should we view these as cultivating just distinct parts of the person? So, of course, you have to pay attention to all of them to flourish as a human being, but you're really cultivating independent and distinct parts. Or would Aristotle say, no, these enterprises are integrated? That is to say, they're mutually supportive, and pursuing excellence in one area actually contributes to excellence in another area or helps supports it.
Good question. Yes, you go for the mean or the morally apt, but I'm sure it moves into also just apt in the sense of understanding that is a fear threat. Whether it's good to show your fear in front of a wolf who may pick it up or not, it's apt to note that that's a fear threat. Yeah. Are they integrated? In some ways, I've thought about this a lot. Especially in my first book, Fabric of Character, because it's very clear that even with regard to the constellation of virtues, some of us shine with respect to one, but not with respect to another. You might think of some people that are particularly temperate in their life. It's very easy for them to modulate their appetite or their drink habits or gambling habits or whatever. I guess if they're habits at that point, they've gone overboard. But they before they get to that point, or if they are at that point, can take corrective measures. But other people, if they don't shine in the exercise of temperance, they shine in the exercise of courage. We think of some very courageous individuals, and others as very generous. Maybe they have a lot to give, they're benefactors, but maybe they are just incredibly generous with their time. So I often thought that it's not just the type that you have all of these dispositions, but the exercise of them, and that requires the external world. What are the occasions and opportunities for you to actually put rubber to the road, act on those dispositions? And then you're often thought of, oh, that's a really courageous person. They wouldn't say of that same person, oh, that's really a temperate person, or that's really a generous person. So you shine in a certain one. But Aristotle and the ancients, Plato in particular, wanted the unity of virtues. Like if you have one, you got them all. And it was never clear to me exactly how to understand that. It's certainly a theme throughout philosophy. Into the medievals, they take it up. But it's hard to really sell that, I think. Except in the way I've just said, maybe you have them all, but some are definitely dominant and expressed, and you would be noted by others for them. So that's one sort of thing, and I guess it goes for the rest of your parts of your life. You don't think of an athlete as the great scholar, Shaq aside, who wanted to be the big Aristotle,
Right.
but time is a limited resource, and so you spend your time exercising, cultivating something, but you hope you haven't left the other things fully out. Yeah. But they might not take prominence. I think that's probably the way to think about it. But now we're much better, I think, than when I was an undergraduate or a younger student in primary and high school. Making exercise a part of our lives, because we realize it's a part of health and it's part of self-maintenance, you might say. And So I think we're better at integrating a lot of things. We don't do a great job, especially at the university, where we have definite athletes people who come here to do athletics, and then people who come here to study and, are in club sports or lesser kinds of engagements in physical activity.
Yeah, good. I want to throw things over to the three of you, but it occurred to me, I used the term the mean at one point. You've used it a couple times now, but I have to believe some of our listeners aren't familiar with Aristotle's doctrine that the moral virtues involve a mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. Do you want to give a quick off-the-cuff?
Sure. Some people think it's a midpoint. And Rosalind Hursthouse, a great Aristotle scholar, railed against this view. And she essentially said, everything is in the middle. It just doesn't as a line or a circle with a midpoint. And so she goes through all the texts, and I have often thought this is the case. The elaboration of the term is more hoste, as it is necessary, or as it's required, or as it's fitting. As it's fitting with respect to that person, with respect to what you do to that person, with respect to how you see that person. And so he says the mean is relative to us. He doesn't mean relativism, but he means it's your take on the situation, your construal, and how you have a fitting response. So with regard, for the right reasons, toward the right end, in the right way, in the right time. It's fitting in that sense. So less a arithmetic midpoint than a judgment call with regard to particulars and salience of those particulars.
Yeah, good, thanks.
All right. Yeah, so the first section of your lecture yesterday, I think you focused on social connection. And you mentioned that too many friendships creates watered down connections. I agree with that overall. But I feel like there's a certain type of person who takes a great amount of, let's just say, soul nourishment out of feeling like they have a lot of friends or they have a lot of connections. Is that something that is truly nourishing to the soul, or is that just, not at all feeding the soul?
Good question. Aristotle in the Politics, I think it's Politics Book 2, is really arguing against Plato's Republic and the idea that you could set up a communal system where everyone of a certain age, a child's age of, 8 to 12, whatever, would call people of another generation, the generation above them, mother or father, mine, he says. And he says Aristotle says you wouldn't think of it as one's own, idion, your own. It wouldn't suffice if you had so many. So he's thinking of it as a direct critique of a political system that gets rid of the intimacy of the family, I guess, and the intimacy of friendships. And he's already written, or, whatever the order of his lectures are, he has in his mind that the best friendships are character friendships, where it would be watery to have too many of those, because you just couldn't spend time together, spend your days together, think together, make common plans together. Actually, he says anti-prohairesis, mutual choices that go back and forth, and that's what we do when we live together and have to have joint plans. So that said, he would he rail against fan bases, followerships? I don't know what he would make of them. I mean, if you listen to some of my students or just live in your families, it can make you anxious. Some of my students have said I get anxious if I don't follow back. It's a kind of diss. And it's negative. I'm putting out a negative vibe, and I thought, that would make me really anxious. And they went on like this, or algorithms, that are generated in part, I guess, because of some of your connections, but other ways of generating these algorithms that might eventually feed into something substantive job likelihood of getting certain jobs or asks. So I just think I'm here with Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, and I think Aristotle channels him, and that is, it's not healthy that you're not really engaging with your soul, exposing yourself a certain way. Well, yes, you expose yourself to a lot of negativity online, I guess, or the potential of that, as well as potential of praise. But you're not exposing yourself to the intimate critique that comes with genuine friendship. And of those, of course, you don't want any everybody telling you who you are and what you could be and should be. It's a trust risk, and you risk that trust, that overture of trust, and with only those that you have some antecedent feeling about that you can trust. And I don't think people have any real knowledge of who's out there that they can trust to make judgment calls on them or their work. And often they're not reading, if it's your work, they're not reading your work. They're reading some one-liner that AI generated or something like that.
Yeah.
And would you say that this is one major distinction between Stoicism and the Aristotelian framework, that only in Aristotle we get that risk component as a serious constitutive feature of friendship relationships? Because it seems friendship, if it's really deep and true friendship, requires a certain kind of unconditionality in the commitment. And
yes.
Parents and children are
Surely.
maybe another example.
Surely.
And is that something that Stoicism kind of rules out, right?
Yeah,
Because it is an
yeah.
indifferent
Yes,
eventually. Right?
eventually. It's a
Ultimately.
preferred indifferent, but it's
Yeah.
not going to be in the core of your happiness. It would be sort of in the periphery somehow, a subordinate kind of level of good. And yes, they don't really talk a ton about intimate friendships, and the risk factor that comes with, can I trust them or not? They talk rather, well, Seneca has an interesting case. He's has it might be imaginary, epistolary relationship with a junior civil servant, we might call him, Lucilius. And it's very much a tutoring relationship, how you can become better, how you can be ruler of yourself. That's not necessarily the kind of living together that Aristotle's talking about. Yeah, so there are risks, and he's really open about it. In one of the chapters of the two books of the Nicomachean Ethics, 8 and 9, I think it's in 9, maybe 7, I'm not sure I have that right, 9:6 or 9:7, he talks about what happens when friends aren't who you thought they were. Maybe you made a mistake in nourishing this friendship, and maybe now you know this person's character isn't great. And if you go down the path with them, you're going down a bad path. Or someone was good, but then opportunities, occasions, turned them into a gambler, or turned them into an alcoholic, or a swindler in the financial markets, or something like that. And you feel if you keep company with this person, you might go there. Or even if you know yourself well enough not to be tempted, you don't want to invest in that kind of friendship. He worries about that. That's very modern concern that we have. You don't hear the Stoics talking about that. They have to rather explain why they're grieving and why it's okay for a Stoic to grieve at the loss of a friend, or if there's a massive, I think there was a massive fire in present-day Lyon, and Seneca would say something to the effect, to his young Lucilius, well, that was so devastating and you couldn't anticipate that it would happen, and so it's okay to grieve. Or he loses, I think it's Serenus, he loses a friend who's much younger than he, and he can't anticipate it. And he says it was foolish on his part to think that just because someone's younger than yourself, that they won't predecease you. Well, this guy did predecease him, and though much younger, and he faults himself for not having rehearsed the the bad that befell him. Aristotle wouldn't go that route.
Circling back to connections, I asked you yesterday about the importance of community within the Stoic framework and also within Aristotle's framework. I wanted to sort of flip that around. So in our reading group, I mentioned once that one of the important takeaways I had was that we have a support system of all the people close to us, but it's important that the self is included in that support system. So I wanted to ask, what's the importance of the self in soul nourishment and feeding the soul? Because what I take away from the three sections is that a lot of the focus is on the people around us, the connections, and then also I guess the physical exertion, but
In the athletic world.
the direct connection to ourselves in soul nourishment. What's that look like in Aristotle's framework?
Well, so you might call it self-study or self-knowledge. He does think that self-study and self-knowledge actually is done best with others. Sounds crazy, but whereas Seneca will be writing to himself late at night about himself, but really more superego, Freud might say, the part of you that's chastening yourself. It's very chastening. Aristotle will think that, he says, your friend is another self. A friend is a mirror. Now, that's not narcissism. It does sound that way, navel-gazing. But he really means, if you look in the rhetoric when he makes comments about friends, they're willing to critique you for your faults. Now, he's not thinking venal faults, but, foibles, we would say. And they'll come honest and clean with you, we might say. And they won't let you run away from yourself. And I do think that's helpful. Aristotle is not putting us on a couch like Freud. He's not saying a friend is a therapist. Whereas the Stoics do call themselves doctors of the soul. They're doing therapy. That's a Greek word, therapeia. They do view themselves as dispensing a kind of medicine. Aristotle never takes on that position, though his father was a doctor, and he certainly must have known about medicine. But he doesn't view soul nourishment as a psychotherapeutic process. He thinks of it more as a natural thing that's part of moral development, which is interesting. We grow up in families. The families are our closest critics. If you're a parent, your children will be your best critic and unabashedly telling you about your faults. And they have radar that picks up an antenna that pick up everything. And they can read every minute facial expression you have and when it's controlled and when it isn't. So he's imagining that kind of environment. He's not being a social psychologist, but he's sort of imagining that. And there is room, though, for self-edification. You go to Socrates wanders off to the gym on his own after the night of inebriation at the symposium for more philosophical exercise. But there are people there that are exercising. I'm sure they're not forced to be there. They're there on their own initiative. So the motivation and aspiration, perhaps an answer to your question, obviously has to come from yourself. And at the end of the symposium, Alcibiades rushes in very drunk and very angry at Socrates that he's not returning his love or sitting next to him on the couch. And he says, "You are the only person before whom I feel shame." And it's called the Tears of Alcibiades. Shame there is a motivator. Aristotle, too, in Nicomachean 4, he knows that shame is a motivator. It's a kind of pre-virtue. It's your own thing, internal emotion that can push you not to just feel negative affect, but to feel the positive affect that I want to aspire to something better. I can be better. I can improve myself. So that's a very self-reflective kind of emotion.
With Aristotle's depiction like of friendship and friends and them holding you accountable and them critiquing you and helping you like learn yourself and all of that, I wonder sometimes, do you ever think it's maybe too romanticized? I'm sure a lot of people have had a bad friend, and maybe you have a friend who thinks they know all and they're critiquing you and telling you things, and you're taking it as I didn't realize I was doing that. And I wonder if Aristotle talks at all about any type of situation like that, when you have someone who appears maybe to be a good friend, or they maybe even genuinely think that their actions are being a good friend, telling you what you need to hear, but maybe it's not helpful, not good, or there is like malintent maybe in over critiquing or whatnot. Does Aristotle have anything to say about those
That's a good
situations?
question, and a worry many of us have, right?
Yeah.
Who are you to tell me that? He has a chapter on when to give up friendship. Often it's because the friend has gone south, you might say. The friend isn't who you thought they were, or the friend has become someone who he no longer or she no longer was. Or the dynamic, he doesn't use the word dynamic, obviously, but the relationship has changed so that you're now at different levels and you can't find parity. And he encourages you to say to yourself, it's okay to give up the friendship.